So, what if the last 30 years of American foreign policy were built on, a flawed foundation? That's the really provocative idea at the heart of the new 2025 National Security Strategy. Today, we're going to deconstruct it, break down the new blueprint it proposes for America's role in the world. At its core, this strategy calls for what it describes as a necessary and welcome correction in U.S. foreign policy. The document makes a point of saying this isn't just another wish list, but a concrete, realistic plan to actually connect America's goals with the means to achieve them. This strategy kicks things off with a pretty sharp diagnosis of the past. It argues that for decades, post-Cold War strategies were nothing more than these laundry lists of wishes, just vague ideas that didn't really get what the country should want, or more importantly, how to get it. All right, so to really get our heads around this new approach, we're going to break it down into 5 key parts. We'll start with the document's take on past failures. Then we'll look at the America First correction it puts forward. After that, we'll dig into the new guiding principles, and then the top priorities. And finally, we'll see how this whole strategy is supposed to work in the real world. So let's dive right into that diagnosis. The document basically frames the last few decades as a time when American strategy just completely lost its way, arguing that a series of bad bets ended up weakening the country from the inside out. And here's the breakdown of that critique. On the one hand, you had these big policy bets on things like globalism and so-called free trade. But according to the strategy, the result of those bets was a hollowed-out American industrial base. It also claims that allies got used to offloading their defense costs onto the U.S., and that a reliance on international groups started to eat away at American sovereignty. Okay, so after laying out the problem, the document gets to its proposed solution, a major course correction centered on America First. The strategy is careful to define this not as some rigid ideology, but more as a pragmatic approach that's simply focused on what works for America. And what's really interesting is how this strategy frames this America First approach. It's not presented as hawkish or aggressive, but as a direct path to peace. The document argues that by using strength and economic leverage, this approach has already brought about unprecedented stability. And to back that claim up, the strategy points to a whole list of diplomatic achievements it says were secured in just 8 months. Now, according to the document, this includes brokering peace between historic rivals like Israel and Iran, resolving conflict between Pakistan and India, and even ending the war in Gaza. Let's move on to the guiding logic behind all this. The strategy lays out a very clear set of core principles that it says are going to drive every single foreign policy decision from here on out. Now, the document actually lists 10 core principles, but let's just hit a few of the really big ones. First, there's peace through strength, the classic idea that a powerful military is your best deterrent. Then there's a predisposition to non-interventionism, which basically sets a really high bar for getting tangled up in foreign conflicts. And crucially, it emphasizes the primacy of nations, stating that it's perfectly natural, and even expected, for all countries to put their own interests first. Underpinning all of these principles is a concept the strategy calls flexible realism. And what that means is a pretty pragmatic approach, basically seeking good relationships with other nations without trying to force American values or our system of government on them, especially when it goes against their own traditions. So you've got the principles, but how does that actually translate into action? Well, the next part of the document outlines some very specific priorities, both for here at home and for out in the world. And the document is incredibly clear about its number one domestic priority. It flat out identifies border security as the primary element of national security, arguing that controlling who and what comes into the country is absolutely essential for survival. When you look abroad, the second huge priority is a pivot away from the U.S. acting as the world's policeman. It's calling for a new era of burden sharing, where wealthy allies are expected to step up and take the main responsibility for security in their own backyards. And this isn't just a suggestion. To enforce this strategy proposes a new Hague commitment. It says this would set a new global standard, requiring NATO allies to ramp up their defense spending from 2% all the way to 5% of their GDP. And finally, the strategy makes a huge point of elevating economic security to the same level as military security. The priorities here are crystal clear: rebalance trade deals, bring industrial production back to America, restore energy dominance, and rebuild the defense industrial base. All right, so for our last section, let's look at how this whole framework is meant to be applied to specific regions. The document lays out a plan of action, and it starts right here in America's own neighborhood. So, for the Western Hemisphere, the strategy pulls from the history books, invoking the old Monroe Doctrine that warned European powers to stay out of the Americas. But then it adds a modern twist it calls the Trump corollary, which aims to stop modern competitors like China from being able to position forces or control strategic assets anywhere in the region.
Okay, so what about the Indo-Pacific? A massively important region, right? The document dedicates a lot of attention to this economic and geopolitical hotspot.
The proposed military shift here is huge. It's moving from what they call firepower projection to a strategy of denial. So think of it less like reacting with force and more like setting up a defensive wall along that first island chain, from Japan down through Taiwan, to stop aggression before it even has a chance to start. And sitting right at the center of that denial strategy is Taiwan. The document flags it as absolutely critical for two big reasons: its geographic position, which is key, and its economic dominance in semiconductors, which it calls a lifeline for the entire global economy.
But, and this is a really big but, according to the document, that support comes with some major conditions. The strategy states pretty plainly that the U.S. can't defend the region alone and will use determined rhetoric to push allies like Taiwan and Australia to seriously ramp up their own defense investments. And really, this quote brings us to this central, unifying theme of the entire document. It's the bottom line. It's the guiding light for every decision, that the interests of America and Americans must always come first. Ultimately, this whole strategy is built on the belief that global order is actually strongest when every single nation unapologetically puts its own interests first. And that leaves us all with a pretty critical question to think about. Is that a recipe for true global stability? Or is it a recipe for even greater conflict?